Well, hello, hi, and welcome. I'm your host Scott, and today I want to talk about a little game called Final Fantasy XVI. Let's get into this. To start off, I'm going to give a little bullet point on the story, just so when I mention things later, it's not as confusing, and then we're going to take it from there. So, Final Fantasy XVI takes place in Valencia, which is ruled over by multiple kingdoms, one of which is Rosaria, where our main character Clive is from. Now, each kingdom has their own Mother Crystal and Dominant. A Mother Crystal being a huge crystal that gathers ether from the world and provides magic to those who can't naturally use it. And Dominants are people who have control over creatures called icons. Each icon represents an elemental type and in turn lends that power to the Dominant. Now with that out of the way, Clive is the son to the Archduke of Rosaria and was next in line to become the Dominant of the Phoenix. Unfortunately, he was skipped and it went to his brother Joshua instead, which is explained why pretty early on. Because of this, Clive becomes what they call his shield, which is more or less a soldier dedicated to protecting the Dominant of the Phoenix. And that is where I'll leave it so that I can be as spoiler free as possible. Based off the opening of 16 alone, it's obvious Square Enix have set up a pretty in-depth world and story. It's a much darker and more mature take than previous Final Fantasy games, but I have to say it is pretty well done. The majority of characters, even some NPCs and side characters, get fleshed out backstories, character growth, and in some cases, full-on redemption arcs, which is only improved by the voice acting, which is also so good. Some side characters I would even say are better written and played out than Clive himself. But that's just my personal opinion. It's one of what will probably be many of my bad takes I have. I'm not saying he's a bad character by any means, but I definitely found myself more invested in other characters that were more interesting and developed better throughout the story. But that is a conversation for another day. I find it almost goes without saying that when it comes to Square Enix releasing a new Final Fantasy game, it's going to look amazing and the soundtrack will be equally as good. Whether it's in battle, running around open areas, in cutscenes, or during the over-the-top boss fights, so I doubt it's hard to believe that 16 is no different in this case. One thing I noticed almost right away with 16 is its similarities to 13. They sacrifice a lot of the open world and exploration for a more linear, cinematic, and storytelling take. That's not to say you can't explore, but it is less rewarding. Where in traditional Final Fantasy games you could find secret areas and dungeons that would reward you with key items, usually better than what's given through regular story means. Instead, 16 gives you crafting materials and with the odd accessory. Now I'm not saying there's no point in running around and enjoying the scenery, since one of the selling points of this game is how good it looks, but I wouldn't hold out on finding anything truly meaningful if you do choose so. That being said, going out to fight all the different creatures in the wild could be rewarding in itself given the combat in this game. It's obviously a very different take from the usual Final Fantasy turn-based system and even the hybrid system as of late. Square Enix leaned completely into the action RPG and take a lot of inspiration from the Devil May Cry franchise, which is no surprise since they had a former Devil May Cry dev design the combat. And I have to say it works. Combat is satisfying and fun. Clive has his basic hack and slash combo with magic that can be cast between each hit or charged for more damage, but the real star of the show are the icon abilities. The icon abilities are insanely powerful and useful, and being able to switch between different icons mid-fight lets for many different playstyles or builds to suit how anyone wants to play. The stagger system introduced in Final Fantasy XIII is here, and it adds an interesting aspect on how to take down different enemies, given different icon abilities can be more effective on breaking the stagger gauge or for more raw damage. Different icons can even allow for dashing around the field, countering attacks, and grabbing enemies out of mid-air. All of this continues to expand as more icons are unlocked through the story and with the abilities you earn through fighting enemies and completing quests. Unfortunately, with all these powers and abilities, it made Final Fantasy XVI really easy. As addictive and fun as it was running around destroying everything, there came a point where I expected to meet a boss or an enemy who could match me, but at best I got was a damage sponge. On top of that, there's no elemental weaknesses, and I know that sounds petty, but when I can kill fire with fire, it circles back to affecting the challenge of Final Fantasy XVI. Not to mention, making strategy and switching icons to take advantage of certain fights is almost pointless. Not completely, obviously, but it does hinder it down to just how you want to play rather than adapting and overcoming something. And just to add insult to injury, there's no party system. You still have people that join your party, but you have no control over them, their equipment, or anything for that matter. And since we're on the topic of challenges, let's talk about the bosses. They are insane. They're absolutely insane and over the top. And I'm not even saying that as something negative either. Every single boss fight in this game is a thrilling cinematic masterpiece, and they got even more ridiculous with every boss fight that followed, as if the next one was trying to one-up the last one. It was wild, with every boss having phases opposed to the usual Final Fantasy just being the final boss having multiple phases. Every phase brought something new to the fight, whether it's new attacks, new forms, a different environment, or all of the above. Either way, the boss fights were by far one of the best parts of the game. The only very small issue I had was with the QTEs. Don't get me wrong, they looked great and fit the ridiculousness. I get why they had them, but a small part of me wished it wasn't at the end of every fight. As petty as it sounds, having a QTE finish a fight for me has never been more satisfying than doing it myself. But I will give it to SquareEnix though. They almost make up for it with how wild the fights get. Believe it or not, there is downtime in Final Fantasy XVI. There's actually a lot of side quests with decent rewards in both items and world building. When it comes to the early game side quests, I'll admit, they're not great, and have little to do with contributing to the world or anything going on for that matter. But I can't say the same about the late game side quests. They have some of the best world building and character development I've seen in some time. Characters you've met in passing in towns or the hideout itself get full backstories and character arcs. And if that wasn't enough, you're given renown points for completing these quests that you can trade in for actual worthwhile items. You can also earn renown points from completing hunts, which is obviously just going out and killing special monsters. But if you want to keep up with some of the best gear in the game, you'll have to do the hunts. Most, if not all, crafting material for the best items in the game are from monsters on the hunt board. If you don't want to do the hunts or you don't care about crafting, you can still buy your gear from markets in towns or the hideout itself. The only issue is they rarely stay on par with the stats of weapons that you can craft. It's always more beneficial to make the crafted weapons than it is to outright buy ones from the market. When it comes to Final Fantasy XVI's story, I don't have a lot to complain about. I think the biggest issue I had was with its pacing. There's some stuff I can't get into for spoiler reasons, but I have to admit there are some points where the game came to a complete halt or would drag its feet to get to the next point of interest. But overall, it's hard to argue that Final Fantasy XVI isn't a good game. It's a huge step away from the usual Final Fantasy experience, and I think that was my issue. I came in expecting all the Final Fantasy tropes and staples from previous games and ended up disappointing myself, and that's on me. I'm all for evolution and experimenting with a franchise. Case in point, Final Fantasy VII's remake. I'm a huge fan of what SquareEnix is doing with that and its new hybrid combat system. I can't say I don't enjoy the action RPG take SquareEnix is leaning into, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that I hope they stick with what they're doing with Final Fantasy VII's remake. And that's gonna be it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know it's been a while since we've done one of these, and it's probably going to be a little rough around the edges until I get my footing back and figure out how I want to do these again. But again, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that dirty stuff. I hope you guys are taking care of yourself and have a good morning, evening, afternoon, or night, wherever you are, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.